Leaders of the three main political parties in Ontario held their final debate Sunday night. Who won? Who lost? Who surprised? The Citizen asked some local political observers to answer these questions for us. They are, Mischa Kaplan, economic development advocate and chair of the West Ottawa Board of Trade; Brigitte Pellerin, a writer, commentator, mother, competitive martial artist, runner and photographer; Kathy Brock, a professor in this school of policy studies, Queen's University; Erin Gee, co-host of the Ottawa-based Bad Bitchy podcast, whose interests range from politics and public policy to food and fashion; and Andrew Cohen, journalist, professor and author. Ontario Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne, left to right, Ontario Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford and Ontario NDP leader Andrea Horwath participate during the third and final televised debate of the provincial election campaign in Toronto, Sunday, May 27, 2018. Frank Gunn, the Canadian press: what has changed most since the first debate, as evidenced by the debaters? Mischa Kaplan: most obvious change since the first debate has been the recent NDP surge, which resulted this evening in both Doug Ford and Kathleen Wynne mercilessly and directly attacking Andrea Horwath. Ford accused the NDP of harboring radical activists, while Wynne suggested, like she did in the first debate, that the NDP's platform is basically a plan built on nice dreams but without a real foundation. It was also nice to see some of the big issues being discussed. The first two debates were very regionally focused, the GTA, and then Northern Ontario, but tonight was about healthcare, collective bargaining, taxes, climate change and affordability, issues that matter to Ontarians across the board. Kathy Brock: the leaders were much less restrained in this debate than in the first one. Doug Ford was more engaged and stayed on message. He didn't stop speaking this time when Andrea Horwath interrupted him. Instead, he continued speaking and focused on his election ideas. Kathleen Wynne was more relaxed, discussing the issues rather than lecturing the audience. She offered thoughtful answers and even identified the common ground among the leaders a few times. She seemed like the Wynne of the last election, a genuine person looking for answers for the people of Ontario. Horwath was even more vocal than in the first debate, interrupting the other leaders and heckling them throughout their portions of the debate, but she capably deflected criticisms of her policy plan and costing. Erin Gee's tide had definitely turned since the last debate. In the first debate, the Kathleen Wynne was the one to beat, but this time the pressure was on Andrea Horwath. Doug Ford was a bit out of his element in both debates, to keep up the momentum the NDP has built over the past few weeks. In both debates, the one considered to be the frontrunner had subpar debates, stumbling on the points they were trying to make and not getting to the crux of their responses quickly enough. In the first debate, Horwath was able to show Ontario who she was, and this time it was Wynne's turn. Despite being the incumbent, Wynne went into this debate as the underdog and her opponents underestimated her. Andrew Cohen: what has changed dramatically? A shift suggested by Andrea Horwath's surprisingly strong performance in the first debate. It is the rise of the New Democrats and the collapse of the Liberals. It has reshaped the campaign and it defined the second debate. If the polls are right, this is now a two-party race between the NDP and the Conservatives, with the NDP having more room to grow as they attract Liberals and unaligned progressives, frightened of Premier Doug Ford. It is why both Ford and Horwath, at every opportunity in the debate, turn their fire on each other, largely ignoring the incumbent, Kathleen Wynne. Each time either was allowed a question to ask of anyone, Ford challenged Horwath and Horwath challenged Ford. The debate was largely about who could discredit each other as they fight for first place, confident the Liberals are firmly in third. Brigitte Pellerin. What has changed since the last debate are the polls. They're showing the NDP doing well, possibly ahead by a smidge. This might explain why Andrea Horwath was so scripted, at least in the first half hour. She was the one with the most to lose, and it showed. She was significantly more hesitant than during the first debate. She sounded and looked stiff and sparkless, until she started interrupting everybody, at which point she became annoying. Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford, for his part, started out aggressively, after being on his very best behavior last time. But he was terribly discombobulated. "Do you know there was a debate tonight? And who stole his time?" For her part, Liberal Kathleen Wynne showed what a fierce debater she is and how much poise she can summon under pressure. You wouldn't have guessed her party was dead last from that performance. Ontario Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne, left, and Ontario Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford shake hands following the end of the third and final televised debate of the provincial election campaign in Toronto, Sunday, May 27, 2018. Frank Gunn, The Canadian Press. What was the most surprising moment and why? Mischa Kaplan. Wynne's ability to present herself as a down-to-earth, honest, thinking human being never ceases to impress me. She began the evening by acknowledging her unpopularity, saying in her opening statement that, "I'm genuinely sorry that people don't like me. This is clearly a new campaign tactic, and it probably makes sense to lean into the punches like this." Wynne knows that she's a liability for her party, but she is embracing this unpopularity and asking voters to judge her not on character or personality, but on her policies, which are in fact quite popular, according to recent polling. "I have written before about what a disaster the current Liberal government has been, but I won't deny that Wynne is a very, very effective campaigner." The other element was the difference between the types of politics at play. There was one moment in which the role of collective bargaining was discussed. It was cerebral, and it demonstrated the extent to which both Wynne and Horwath are really policy wonks, as opposed to Ford, who has been fairly effective in brushing off criticism over his lack of platform, lack of policy knowledge, and tendency to rely on clichés and platitudes. The most surprising moment was the exchange between Wynne and Horwath on Horwath's election promise that an NDP government would not use back-to-work legislation. Horwath gave a surprisingly weak answer, not answering the question directly. Wynne was much stronger, pointing out the need for this legislation after the collective bargaining option fails. Horwath interrupted her, criticizing the Liberal relationship with unions to the point that Wynne seemed impatient if not angry for a moment. Wynne showed her leadership style when she came back and explained the need for a balance between labor and management rights to serve the public interest. Doug Ford didn't seem to be paying attention to the exchange and said that he was the only one who would stand up for the people. The exchange seemed to capture a heightened degree of acrimony between Horwath and Wynne. Erin Gee is surprised that the PCs still haven't released a costed platform. The election is 10 days away and early voting started this weekend, but yet Ford and his party have not told voters what their plan is. Ford said that as Premier his government would be the most transparent government ever in Ontario, and yet they are unwilling to inform the voters of their plan for the province. What's even more surprising is that when pushed on the lack of a costed platform, Ford thought that standalone costed policy announcements constituted the same thing as a platform. For someone who touts his experience and record of success, Ford should know that's not the case. How can we measure success when we have no baseline of what to expect? Brigitte Pellerin was taken aback by the sexual misconduct question and discussion that followed. "I never expected this topic to make it to a political debate. Mind you, all the leaders had to say was meaningless rhubarb. It's awful. Serious problem. Doing all we can. Won't give up." Did we mention it's serious? But the biggest surprise was Doug Ford, in the middle of that discussion on sexual misconduct, accusing the NDP of taking inspiration from Adolf Hitler because a candidate quoted him on social media 5 years ago. The quote itself would be harmless from anyone else. Obviously there should be a rule never to quote Hitler about anything ever, if you don't want to be kicked out of polite society. But to use this 2013 incident to suggest today's NPDers are inspired by Nazis is crass and classless. Ontario Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne, right, and Ontario NDP leader Andrea Horwath chat following the end of the third and final televised debate of the provincial election campaign in Toronto, Sunday, May 27, 2018. Frank Gunn, the Canadian press who won. Mischa Kaplan, he'd say probably Ford. There wasn't much tonight that would convince a Ford supporter to jump ship, and he might have even convinced some voters that he's not the crazy conservative nut that the Liberals and NDP are trying to make him out to be. Ford acknowledged his belief in man-made climate change, and voiced support for fair, collective bargaining. He spoke well about the PC plan to reduce childcare fees, and he seemed much more confident tonight than during the first debate. Wynne is unequivocally the best debater in the bunch, but it's hard to see what she's fighting for at this point. Most pollsters seem to associate her very much with the "dead man walking" syndrome, so her success this evening seems irrelevant. Horwath did a lot of interrupting, and she's not a very strong debater. She has trouble appearing confident, and she's clearly still vulnerable to the baggage from the previous NDP government of the early 90s, a weakness which Ford exploited effectively when he talked about how terrifying an NDP government would be. Having said that, I don't think she said or did anything this evening that will hurt her chances at the polls. Kathy Brocky, I'm tempted to say that Kathleen Wynne won because she showed her old debating style and made her points well. But after reflecting on the debate, I have to say that the real winners were the voters of Ontario. Tonight they saw three very different leaders with very different ideas for the future of Ontario. They all showed their passion and deep commitment to making Ontario stronger. The leaders all had different strengths and weaknesses, but all would bring something important to government. In the exchanges, they also made each other aware of where they needed to improve if they formed government. In short, the three leaders presented the people of Ontario with a real choice. The people of Ontario won. Erin Gee. Kathleen Wynne was the clear winner in tonight's debate, and she brought her A game. Starting with her opening statement, she was folksy with her "sorry, not sorry" remarks and came ready to be assertive when necessary. Her answers were concise and hit all the main Liberal talking points while coming across the most accessible as she has in a while. Wynne was also able to portray herself as the experienced, mature candidate in the race when juxtaposed with Horwath's wide-eyed naivete and Doug Ford's fly-by-the-seat-of-his-pants approach. Wynne has always been a strong debater, so it was good to see her find her wheelhouse in this debate and show that she is still worthy of being elected on June 7. Andrew Coe and Andrea Horwath had a strong debate but was occasionally irritable and impatient. She came across as the front-runner, informed and self-confident. Doug Ford offered red meat to his conservative base. The NDP would annihilate the middle class and terrify business and bring disaster, but came across as a windy ward healer, repeating canned lines as the captain of cliché. It is unlikely he expanded his base. The winner, if there was one, was Wynne. Defiant, feisty and authoritative, she positioned herself between Doug Ford, whom she warned would cut essential programs and services and who would not release his platform, and Andrea Horwath, whom she said would raise taxes and take orders from organized labor. She tried mightily to cast the Liberals as the centrist, sensible alternative between right and left. It may not be enough to save her government with a record of 15 years, but it will help her save the furniture. She presented herself as the adult in the room, moderate, practical and empathetic. Brigitte Pellerin, who won, sure wasn't Ford. He was painfully unprepared and looked like he didn't belong on that stage. He was the butt of all the jokes and deserved to be. No, Kathleen Wynne won that one. She looked confident, calm and collected. She mostly refrained from throwing mud and looked very much Premier-like. If Wynne's goal was to remind everyone that she wasn't as extreme as the other two leaders, she did a decent job of it. It won't save her party, but her supporters will think she went out on a high note. Her best line of the evening was when she explained that political leadership is finding the fairest way forward for the largest number of people. A noble sentiment that might have allowed her to remain in office if she and her party had bothered to follow it. But that's a discussion for another day.